Satan is simply the great counterfeiter. And so I'm going to take a similar basic outline to the lesson this week. God encourages His people, and by His providence, and by His word. And so what Satan does is just make a cheap copy of that to accomplish his own goals. And so we're going to notice that Satan encourages his people and seeks to discourage God's people by his people and by his own providence. And I'll explain more what I mean by Satan's providence, and by his words, which of course always are lies. We won't be surprised by that if we just remember who this enemy is. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 10, Jesus called him Satan. And Satan just means enemy. It means adversary. So we won't be surprised that Satan tries to discourage God's people when we remember that his primary identity is one of an enemy. Satan is an enemy. The word devil, why is he called devil? The word devil just means a slanderer or an accuser, and sometimes it's used in the Bible of people. So it just identifies the very core of what he does is to slander and to accuse. Jesus called him the father of lies. He called him a murderer from the beginning. He said in Ephesians 2, Paul said he's the prince of the power of the air, just identifying him more with this world. He's called the ruler of this world in John 12 and verse 31. And then maybe most well known is that he's called a roaring lion. So Peter tells us to be watchful, to be aware. A lion is one who destroys. Everything the lion sees is viewed as prey. And if you've ever watched a documentary about lions, you see that the ones they hunt, they're opportunistic. They don't typically go to the front of the herd and just take them all on. They look for a moment of weakness. It may be some who are sick, some who are young, some who are old, or even or by surprise. Lions look for a point of weakness and seize upon that. And so Satan is described as a roaring lion. And so if we think about him in these ways, God has given us some words to help us to understand an enemy that we can't see, then we won't be surprised by any tactic that he takes. One other thing that we need to remember, though, about Satan that God implies is that Satan is limited. Satan is limited. We see that in the garden. When Satan went into the Garden of Eden, did God overlook that? Did he sneak in behind a tree or around a corner and God wasn't aware? We're not told the details of how all that transpired, but we know enough about God to know Satan didn't sneak in and take God by surprise. Satan went there intending to do whatever his intentions were, but Satan was limited in what he could do. God either explicitly or just permitted Satan to go into the garden. And God had a plan to protect Adam and Eve. If they had followed it, they would have been fully protected. But Satan was limited in what he could do in the garden. And I'm convinced of that mainly because of what we're told, that the brief insight we get in Job chapter 1. When Job wanted to do something, or when Satan wanted to do something similar to Job, and I won't go back and read it. We'll talk a little bit more about Job later. But in Job chapter 1, Satan goes before God and makes some accusations. He slanders Job. And then he's given some permission, but he's not given total permission. And from what we know about Satan, he would have done more if he could have done more. And so God didn't send Satan as his own messenger, but God permitted Satan to do some of the things he wanted to do, but God limited what he could do to Job. Likewise, when Satan came to this earth and appeared in some form to Jesus, again, that didn't take the Father by surprise or the Spirit by surprise. In fact, in Matthew 4, the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. So nothing that he did there was outside of God's knowledge, even if it was outside of God's will. And then we're going to look later at Paul's thorn in the flesh, which I believe also implies Satan had a plan and wanted to do something. He had some intent in what he did to harm Paul. But what we know about Satan is he would have done more if he could have done more. And so there's not a book of Satan that details Satan's history and everything about him, but we get these hints and these clues so that we understand who he is. And the better that we understand how he works, that is intended to build some fear, but our fear should be limited by our confidence that Satan is limited. He's limited, but he's active. And Satan encourages his people in an effort to discourage God's people. Well, think about what do I mean that Satan has people? In Matthew chapter 25, if you're there, in verse 41, this description of the day of judgment, Jesus says that it will be said to those on the left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels." And so don't let our entertainment industry or little comic strips fool you. Hell is not Satan's home that he prepared for himself. No, God made hell as a place for the devil and for his angels, Jesus says. And his followers are described in Ephesians 6 and verse 12 in a little more graphic terms and in a variety of ways. Ephesians 6 verse 12, they're described as the rulers of darkness, principalities, powers, spiritual host of wickedness. And so I can't draw a picture. I don't know what all of those look like or hardly how to visualize it, but these words are just enough to tell us Satan is working, but he's not working alone. He has hosts, principalities, powers. He has those who are his. Somehow it came to be that he was the leader, and they are following him. But it isn't just these spiritual beings that we cannot see. In John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus said to the religious leaders that you are of your father, the devil. You are of him. You are from him. In other words, you belong to him because you do the same kind of things that he did. You lie, and he's the father of lies. And he is a murderer from the beginning. And Jesus was sending a not-so-subtle message to them that I know what you're planning, and I know where you got your ideas from. Your father, the devil, is encouraging you to do the things that you are planning to do. And in 1 John 3, verse 8, John really echoes that same point. He who sins is of the devil. He who sins got his ideas not from himself, and we all got our ideas from someone else, but they got their ideas from someone else, and they got their ideas from someone else. And ultimately, if you trace that genealogy back, the genealogy of those ideas, they go back to Satan. And so yes, Satan has people in the heavenly places, in a spiritual realm, beings that we can't see and understand very well. But then we can understand very well that Satan has people on earth. And from time to time, we do well to ask ourselves, am I classified among those people? Because there are people who are Satan's and don't know it, who are Satan's and would deny it. Could that be me? Could that be you? Doesn't mean that we are, but it's a question worth asking. Then go to the book of 1 Peter. We're going to spend the rest of this point in the book of 1 Peter, beginning in chapter 2. Satan uses his people to encourage his people. Satan uses his people to discourage God's people. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, and even back to chapter 1, verses 6 and following, Peter's writing to the saints in Asia, and he says, you are enduring a fiery trial, and he even makes it clear that your suffering is not over. And so he reminds them in verse 11, as they go through this trial of chapter 2, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. In this case, the Gentiles would simply be a way of expressing Satan's people. Have your conduct honorable among them, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. So implied in all of this is that Satan is working, but Satan isn't doing it alone. The Gentiles Satan is encouraging his people to do his work. And who are those people? And in chapters 2 and 3 and 4, Peter goes into detail to identify Satan's people and the work that they are doing and that they are encouraging others to do and that they are discouraging God's, for the purpose of discouraging God's people. So that begins in verse 13. Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors or to those sent by him, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers. Here, Peter is not just giving a random teaching of, in order to follow God, you need to obey the authorities. He's teaching that, but it's in the context of suffering. It's in the context of, verse 12, that the Gentiles are going to speak evil of you. Some of those Gentiles were the religious leaders of that day. At this point in history, it's the Roman rulers, civil leaders. And what they often did was speak against God's people and accuse God's people and then encourage other people to be stirred up against God's people. And if you like a little bit of history, then you can go back and read about Nero and other Roman emperors who did that and other leaders who did that same kind of thing that just illustrate that Satan was encouraging his people to do his work and to discourage God's people. And we could spend the next hour looking at examples of that through history. But history just reminds us not to be surprised when history repeats itself, as is sometimes said. So we shouldn't be surprised when leaders do the same kinds of things today. We shouldn't be surprised at whatever level it may be. In our society, the president is just the most visible leader. And the reality is that our current presidential candidates, occasionally, both of them, they offer lip service to God, but by their life, it's evident they don't take God or His Word seriously. They both may hold up a Bible. And I'm not telling you who to vote for. My point is just what Peter is saying is civil leaders are typically doing the will of Satan to encourage Satan's people to do his work and to discourage God's people. So don't put your hope in a civil leader. Obey them, submit to them, and then within our form of government, do what in your conscience you think is best for our nation. That's not my topic. The point is, but don't put your trust in them, because for the most part, they are Satan's people, encouraging Satan's people to do his will and to discourage God's people. And most of our civil leaders today have more in common with Pilate and even with the Pharisees than they do with Jesus or his apostles or even his disciples. There can be exceptions. And when there are God's people who are leaders in the civil realm, that's good. We can be blessed by that. And if you think you have that opportunity, then do what is in your conscience. But here Peter is reminding them that Satan will use civil leaders. And so we have to struggle by submitting to those who even cause us to suffer. But that's exactly what he tells us to do. Then in verses 18 to 23, he in principle repeats the same thing. He just says, but there's another kind of leader who also may cause you to suffer, who may speak against you as an evildoer, and they are the Gentiles, meaning they are they are Satan's people. He goes into the area of the workplace, as we might say it. In verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh, for this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. So here we would just call this the workplace, that Satan uses harsh leaders in order to stir up hard hearts. Think about a harsh leader, a servant of Satan, who has a servant who is a servant of Satan. Well, what happens? the harsh leader stirs up the hard heart of a servant, and so the servant is going to undermine or backtalk or quietly be disobedient, be dishonest. So he's going to fight back against the harsh master. That's just going to stir up one against the other. It's going to spread among the servants. Satan encourages his people to encourage his people. But then among those people caught in the fray sometimes are God's people. And it may be hard for us to understand completely the circumstance that some saints lived in, being a servant, being one of God's servants, working alongside other co-servants who were Satan's servants, who were led by one of Satan's servants. Talk about discouraging, talking about a hard workplace. Maybe you've had a job before in the past or present. You hated working there. Well, then maybe you can identify with what's being described here. But what he tells them in verse 20 is, yes, you're going to suffer because Satan encourages his people to do his work. But if you suffer for doing what is right, and if you'll accept that patiently, then this is commendable to the Lord. But don't be surprised when Satan's people encourage others to do his work and even discourages you in the process. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, he makes a similar point, just applies it in another area where we spend some time. We spend some time in our family. And so he says, wives, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. So he begins by talking about unbelieving husbands, like unbelieving masters, like unbelieving civil leaders. So his principle, his basic point in all of these overlap over each other. That Satan is not ashamed to use a civil leader or a master or your spouse to encourage you in evil and to discourage you from doing good. He's not ashamed to use your husband. He's not ashamed or embarrassed to use your wife. Now, the lesson we learned from last week is God is trying to encourage us. God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. That implies, again, Satan is limited. Satan is limited. God limits him in what he can do. But sometimes in the process, God's saints will suffer because of Satan's people. And so here first he begins with wives. And he says in verse 2, the English Standard says that God will use their respectful and pure conduct when their leader, it could be a master, it could be a civil leader, and what he describes before is that as a citizen or as a servant, you should use respectful and pure conduct in your relationship with them, even if they are not doing the same. So he's really echoing the same point. In verse 4, he describes her as having a gentle and quiet spirit. And again, he's not just describing marriage in general. He's describing civil leaders who cause suffering, masters who cause suffering. So here the theme implies he's even talking about husbands who would cause their wives to suffer. And it's not any fault of their own, but what we could apply even back to chapter 3, verse 18. As a spouse, if you suffer wrongfully, can you suffer patiently? This is commendable before God. In verse 7, he addresses then the husbands. And again, I think just some of the carryover, he's saying less as he goes through, but he's building upon what he's already said. And so husbands are told, regardless of the conduct of their wife, the conduct of the wife doesn't affect anything that is said in verse 7. Husbands, dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. And so maybe you've heard a lesson about that. Husbands, your prayers could be hindered. Well, he's not introducing anything new. You could apply that back to the wives. Wives, your prayers could be hindered. Servants, your prayers could be hindered. Citizens, your prayers could be hindered. All of this is making the same point. And if you read the rest of chapter 3, after giving these few examples of how Satan encourages his people to do his will, he spends the next paragraph talking about suffering wrongfully. And so don't be the leader who encourages those following you to do the will of Satan. When your leader encourages you to do the will of Satan, or when your leader discourages you from doing the will of God, then go back and read 1 Peter chapter 3. What he says applies there in all of these circumstances. He talks about willingly suffering for doing what is right, and he builds their confidence that when that happens, when you're in that circumstance, that God sees it and God will save you. He brings up the example of Noah. We just get a short glimpse into the life of Noah. We get an even briefer glimpse into the suffering that Noah endured, being the only family on the entire face of the earth who was faithful to God. And if you remember the condition of the world at that time, there were violence. Of all that is said, that implies that tells us the world, the culture that Noah was living in. So he lived in that. He certainly suffered, and God saw it, and God saved him. And in this case, Peter uses the example that God saved him by water. And so the end of 1 Peter chapter 3, a verse that maybe we often use to try to teach friends and neighbors and even strangers in the efforts the church here is making in the upcoming days and weeks, the Saturday Golden Days, and when we go to the State Fair. If you'll help with that work, you may talk to someone about the subject of water baptism. You might use 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, that baptism now saves us. It's a powerful point and verse. But don't ever forget the context of that verse. Peter was not trying to convince the Baptist or the Protestant that baptism does have a part in salvation. It can have that effect. But when Peter talked about that subject, he was talking to Christians who were suffering. And his point is, God saved Noah when he was suffering for doing what was right. And God used water to save him. And so if you're suffering, go back to the fact and to the time that God saved you. If you're suffering, go back to the time that God forgave your sin. Because your sin is a bigger problem than your suffering from a civil leader, from a master, even from a spouse. Your sin was a bigger problem. And God solved that problem, and God saved you the day that by faith you were baptized in water. So if God provided a solution to that problem, then God will provide a solution when your leader, whomever it may be, is influenced by Satan and encouraged by Satan to discourage you. That thought flows then into chapter 4. In verses 1 through 2, he reminds us again, Christ suffered. So if you suffer, you're not alone. Christ already suffered, and he endured that willingly. And then in verse 3, then Peter returns to another example and occasion where we might suffer. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. Paul's there. Again, Gentiles, in this case, just means Satan's people. And he reminds them that if some make you suffer, then remember that there was a time where you were just like them. You were no different than them. You were either doing exactly the same things that they are doing, or you were doing other things that are equally as evil and that separated you from God, just like it separates them from God. He says, we've done it too. Continue. When we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries, in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So he gives these examples, lewdness and lusts. That's like what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 5. Whoever looks upon a woman to lust for her, that's lewdness and that's lust. That's a kind of sin. Then he talks about a different kind of sin, drunkenness, revelry, drinking parties. Today we would talk about the the club scene, or maybe just around the campfire, a little more socially acceptable than the club scene where you got to present your ID to get in. But anybody can sit around the campfire and have a few drinks. That's what he's talking about. We've spent our lifetime doing that, enough of our lifetime doing that. He mentions abominable idolatries. We might just say there that's false religion. In their time, false religion was wherever the saints were meeting. Well, just down the street and around the corner, there was a temple to Zeus or Aphrodite or some other idol. So today, the primary false religion in our culture is not that same kind. Today, it's often a kind of people who call Jesus Lord, Lord, but do not do the things that he said. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 7:21-23. That would be today's equivalent, or another example of abominable idolatries. And so he says we've all participated in the same kinds of things they participate in. But when the time comes in our life and in our faith, when we stop, when we change, and when we are forgiven, well, he says they're going to notice something has changed. And some of them won't even be impressed by it. In fact, they'll think it's strange, they'll think it's different, they'll think it's odd, and they will speak evil of you. Satan, using his people to encourage his people and to discourage God's people. And in verse 5, Peter reminds them, whoever the source of the suffering is, he says in verse 5, and whatever suffering they inflict upon you, he says, they may be a civil leader, they may be your master, they may be your spouse, they may be a stranger. They will not get away with it. Verse 5, they're going to give an answer for what they say. They're going to give an answer for what they do. They won't escape, but you let God bring that vengeance. But then also remember that you are going to give an answer for how you endure that suffering. You're going to give an answer. And if your answer is to live by faith, if the ways of Christ are your answer, then we don't have to be ashamed or embarrassed or fearful about standing before God and giving an answer for how we responded to Satan's people who discouraged us. If Satan could take control of our spirit and force us to do something, he would. But he can't. Satan is limited. If he could appear to people, I suppose he would pick his time and place where he would do that more often. He tried it with Eve, and he did that with Jesus. I suppose Satan would do that more often if he could. But he doesn't, because he is limited. He's limited by God. But one way that Satan is permitted to do his work of rebellion is by the decisions of people who think like he thinks, and who does things like he does. And by that, Satan does his work. By that, Satan encourages his people. And by that, Satan works to discourage God's people. Well, God tries to encourage us. God provides for us, sometimes in ways we can't fully even grasp and define. We looked at that last week. I think in a way, Satan does that. We usually use the word providence to meaning something that God provides that is helpful. Well, what I mean by Satan's providence is there are ways and times that Satan attacks, and when he attacks us, we don't really know that he is. We feel the effect of it, but we don't really know how to explain the source. Just the opposite of what we looked at last week. Here's what I mean by that. Go back to the book of Job. Job chapter 1. Here's what I mean by Satan's limited providence. God is unlimited in what he does. But Satan does some things that are in some ways behind the curtain. We can't know them. We can't understand or even know what he does or that he did it. But there are times where he is doing things. He's providing something, not to help, but of course for the opposite purpose. Look down at verse 16. In Job chapter 1, you remember, Satan comes to God. He slanders Satan, and in effect, he slanders God as well. And so God gives Satan the opportunity to take some things away from Job, but God limits what he can do. Well, Satan uses his people to do his work. They're raiders, they're thieves who come and kill and steal from kill Job's servants and steal his possessions. In verse 16, Satan does something different than use his people. While some bad news was brought to Job while he was speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." What he's calling the fire from God, I suppose, is lightning. Whatever it was, in some way they attribute it to God. But we know that God was not willing to attack Satan. God limited what Satan could do. So somehow Satan used, if I'm right, lightning to attack Job. In verse 19, some more bad news was brought. And in verse 19, he's told, "Your children were all together, and suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Satan uses lightning, or whatever that fire was. It was not sent by God. We know that. That's just how they described it or perceived it. And Satan used wind to discourage Satan. He didn't use people. Now, again, the fire from God, if that's lightning, well, lightning is natural. It's not something supernatural. Its purpose is not primarily to cause harm. In fact, it has some purposes that are beneficial. It can sometimes cause some harm. But when you see a strike of lightning, is your thought, "Oh, Satan's attacking someone like he did Job"? I don't think every strike of lightning is like that. But this lightning was like that. This lightning was a specific part of Satan's plan to attack Job, to discourage Job. Now, Job and the others, they had no way of knowing that. Satan used it in this way, but Satan was limited in what he could do. If Satan could have struck everyone on earth or all of God's people directly with lightning, would he do it? I think he would have. If he could have struck Job with lightning, would he have? We know later he would have, because he did something just as bad or maybe worse. Likewise, most of the time, wind is natural. Often it's helpful. And so when wind happens, we don't think, "Oh no, wind's happening. Well, Satan's attacking someone. Satan's sending that wind after me." We don't perceive it. We don't think of it that way because it usually is not that way. But in this case, it was something that looked natural, looked normal, but it had a very specific purpose. It had a very specific goal that was not from God, that was from Satan. It was limited. It was limited in what it could do, because would Satan have sent some wind to harm Job? Well, I think he would have if he could have, but he was limited in what he could do. Then put that alongside, go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul's thorn in the flesh. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 and 8. Paul says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan." That sounds a lot like Job. "A messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me." Analyze what is said here. Paul receives this thorn in the flesh, and he says the purpose of it, or one purpose, was to buffet me. Who had that purpose? To buffet Saul, to discourage Saul. That was Satan's purpose. But Paul says there was another purpose. lest I be exalted above measure. Would Satan have that purpose? Would Satan send a thorn in the flesh to Paul so that Paul would not be exalted? No, Satan would be glad for him to be exalted. That's God's purpose. But God didn't send the thorn in the flesh. It wasn't from God. It wasn't a messenger of God. It was a messenger of Satan to discourage Paul. God could use that same occasion to strengthen and encourage Paul. That was the result. But here's the question. When the thorn in the flesh came, whatever it was, and by calling it a thorn in the flesh, to me it sounds like some kind of physical limitation. If it was a physical limitation, well, people have physical limitations all the time. Whenever you have some kind of a physical limitation, or you see someone in a wheelchair or with some disease, do you think, oh, Satan must be attacking them? Well, no. People have physical limitations because of the course of time, wear and tear on the body, or because of some incident, some injury. That happens all the time. But whatever it was that happened to Paul, this thorn in the flesh, if it was a physical limitation, it wasn't something that was just the result of use. It wasn't merely an injury. It was something specifically sent by a messenger of Satan to discourage Paul. And Paul couldn't even have known that it was a messenger of Satan. That he was apparently given that insight that Job never knew. Job never was given the insight that we have about what happened to him. So here's what I mean. Satan provides some things, and I call it his providence, his limited providence. He does some things sometimes that we don't know he did it. And he does it in ways that we could never trace it and explain it by observation and even by study. I don't know that we could ever say, well, that happened and Satan did that. Because what is done is so similar and happens to other people for not for reasons that could be attributed to Satan. So when does that happen today? That Satan is the source of some occasion that appears routine, but is actually a specific attack from Satan. And no surprises here. I don't know. Just like God's providence, I can't always say, I know God is the one who did that. All I can say is, in the case of Satan, just like the opposite in the case of the Lord, I know Satan is busy. I know he's working against us. That's for sure. I know that he is doing everything that he can. And I'm encouraged by knowing that's limited. I know that he would do more if he could, but he's limited. I also know that Satan does more things than I could ever realize. Just like with Job. And again, with Paul, he only knew what he knew. That insight was given to him. So I know Satan is working, doing as much as he can. I know that he's limited, doing more than I know that he is doing. And Satan is doing that to encourage his people and to discourage God's people. And that matters for these two reasons. Number one, when there are frustrations, then don't direct your frustration at God. Job got to the point that he did that. And in Job 42, he even says, I repent in dust and ashes. I've said too much. I tried to explain things that were beyond my ability to know. Don't direct your frustrations at God when you don't have an explanation. You can say, perhaps Satan did this, or perhaps I just don't have an explanation, and that's difficult because that's often where we end up. But now look at verses 9 and 10, the way that Paul learned to deal with this frustration, and the way that ultimately I think Job learned at the end of the book of Job. Paul says it this way, when he was told, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. When I am weak, then I am strong. Seek God's help in your deepest frustrations and limitations, especially when those things are brought upon you for Christ's sake. Because Satan's plan is for you to focus on and talk about and think about mostly the limitations or the frustrations, and to pay more and more attention to that and less attention to God's plan to strengthen you. Because the end of the book of Job, and even in the process of those things, God's plan, why did God permit Satan to do all that? Because he knew it would strengthen Job's faith. Why did God permit Satan to bring the thorn in the flesh? Because God knew it could strengthen Paul. And whatever God allows and permits Satan to do, beyond our ability to know what he's doing, Satan has a plan, but God has a plan to encourage and to strengthen us somehow. And then last week we noted God uses His Word to encourage us. Satan uses his words, but his words are lies. Satan is not embarrassed to try to use some lie about God to encourage his people and to discourage us. And that was the tactic of Satan in Matthew chapter 4 when he tempted Jesus. The very first thing he says, well, if you are the Son of God. Does that ring a bell to any other time that Satan tempted someone, that he asked a question or he made something appear to be in doubt? Does that ring a bell with, has God said, you shall not eat of the tree? If you are the Son of God, he's the slanderer. Satan knew the answer. Jesus knew the answer. Eve knew the answer. Satan seeks to put doubt in areas where there is no doubt to everybody that's involved. And then in verses 5 and 6, Satan tried to use a promise of God as a reason for Jesus to do the will of Satan. Think about that. He tried to use a promise of God to encourage Jesus to do the will of Satan. Oh, jump off the temple, it'll be fine. The angels will take care of it. That's what God promised. He's a liar, and he will invent lies, number one, about God. I can't give you a whole list of those. Again, at the fair over the next few weeks, or one of these booths, you may meet somebody. Well, is God real? Has God spoken? Can I know the Bible is from God? You'll meet people who may honestly not know, but Satan plants those questions not to encourage people to ask questions and to learn. Satan plants those doubts when he knows there is a God and he knows God gave the Bible. And again, that list is much, much longer, but Satan will lie about God in order to persuade people to do his will. He will lie about others. In Genesis 4 and verse 8, this is when Cain invited his brother, hey, come out to the field with me. We're just not given a lot of detail. What was the convoluted thinking of Cain? We're not given all that insight. But to do what he did to his own brother, it just makes me wonder, did he make up some lie in his mind to make him feel justified about killing Abel? People will do that. They believe some lie and then they feel okay about what they do to others. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32, God just helps to prepare us. And think about Cain in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. My guess is that was some, if not all of those things contributed to getting Cain to the point of where he was when he did what he did when he killed his brother. And so God helps us. Don't believe some lie that when we're bitter, that when we're angry, then we start to believe things that are not true. Instead, verse 32, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. Satan will try to convince you of a lie so that you'll sin against others. And then he won't stop there. Last, he'll convince you of some lie about yourself. And if you'll believe something that is not true about God or others or yourself, then Satan can get you where he wants you to be. In Genesis chapter 3, in that conversation that I'm assuming you remember that Satan had with Eve, who did Satan focus her mind and her attention on? He got Eve thinking a lot about herself. He inflated her own idea about herself and her potential and her rights. She deserved to have this knowledge. That God, how dare God withhold that knowledge from her? And then as she looked at the tree, it looked, we say the grass is greener, and the fruit looked sweeter on the other side of the tree. And she deserved to have that. Satan got Eve spending a lot of time thinking about herself, to the point that she believed things about herself that were not true, and then that she ignored what she knew very well to be right and true about God. And Satan today can do the same. He can convince people to believe things about themselves that are not true. And that's a long list. I won't try to give you all of them. He can convince some people that, well, I'm too good to be lost. Now, I mean, those murderers and all, those people, that they'll be lost. But Satan wouldn't send me to hell because, and then we can make a list of all of our good traits. We can do that. And then we can believe a lie about ourselves. And Satan can go to the other extreme and convince some people that they are too bad to be saved. That, well, I've done this and the other, and even God can't help me at this point. So Satan is not ashamed or embarrassed. He has no limitations in his own mind, and he will encourage you to sin by his lies. God offers to encourage you in a way and to equip you so that you can recognize his lies. And this is no surprise, because Satan, all he does is take God's plan, alter it, adjust it, tweak it, and then make it his own. And so God uses his people and his providence and his word to encourage his people. And so Satan can observe some of that and say, oh, not a bad idea. I'll use my people and my own limited opportunities and my own lies to encourage my people. And Satan wants that message taken in all the world to every creature. This past week, you were encouraged. By who? And today, as we sing this song, God is trying to encourage you, and Satan is trying to encourage you. Whose encouragement have you accepted? Whose encouragement are you accepting? And whose encouragement will you accept this week? God has plans this week to encourage you. Satan has plans this week to encourage you. As we sing this song, we encourage you to think about your heart and soul and mind and your strength, your body and your spirit, and think about who will God forgive. And if you're here and you know that you're separated from God because of your sin, do you know that God will forgive your sin if you'll confess your own faith and repent of your sins and be baptized in water? Do you know that as a Christian, God will forgive you if you will confess your sin to him and ask for his forgiveness? If our prayers will encourage you this morning, right now, we offer our time, we offer our help in any way. And if we can provide that this morning, come forward, tell us how we could as we stand and sing.